You know Cleopatra, last pharaoh of Egypt, famed seductress, Roman lover, asp-ridden corpse. But long before her tragic end, long before her first affair with Julius Caesar, or that famously over-the-top suicide, she was just a girl standing in front of a family tree, deciding which relatives needed to die. This is the true story of Cleopatra's dynasty, a royal house so drenched in betrayal, incest and murder that Game of Thrones looks like a bedtime story. And the bloodiest chapter? It wasn't written by Cleopatra, it was written by her older sister, the princess who slaughtered her own brothers, exiled her own sisters, and declared herself pharaoh, not because the gods chose her, but because everyone else was dead. Her name was Berenice IV, and her reign of blood paved the way for Cleopatra's.
Act 1. Born into a bloodbath. Imagine growing up in a palace where smiling too hard at your sibling might get you stabbed. That was life under the Ptolemies. Cleopatra's dynasty ruled Egypt for almost 300 years, and never once married outside the family. They were Greek royals ruling an Egyptian kingdom, and like the Habsburgs, they believed the only way to preserve their power was to marry their siblings. Not metaphorically, literally. Brother to sister, sister to brother, aunt to nephew. Genetics. Never heard of her. If you were a child in the Ptolemaic family, you didn't play tag. You practiced poison mixing. This was a dynasty where the average family reunion could double as a murder mystery dinner, except the murder wasn't a twist. It was the opening act. By the time Berenice IV was born around 77 BCE, the family tree wasn't so much a tree as it was a noose. Her father was Ptolemy XII, a man so incompetent, so deeply despised by his own people, they gave him a nickname. Orleats. It means the flute player, not because he was artistic, because they thought he fiddled while Egypt burned. This man bankrupted Egypt with bribes to Rome, ignored famine, and oh yeah, murdered his way to the throne by allegedly poisoning his own mother. Wholesome. Berenice watched all this from the shadows. She was one of several royal daughters largely ignored, because in this dynasty daughters weren't born. They were bred to marry their brothers or die trying. And Berenice? She had no interest in marrying anyone. She wanted the throne. So when her father fled Egypt in disgrace in 58 BCE, she saw her chance. Rome had called in its debts. The people of Alexandria were rioting. The Nile stank with famine and sewage. And dear old Dad, he ran, leaving his wife, daughters, and throne behind. Cue Berenice's villain origin story. Act 2. The rise and the murders. When the king abandoned Egypt, most royals panicked. Berenice smiled. Because for the first time in her life, the throne was wide open, and the only thing standing between her and it were a few inconvenient siblings, and her own mother. At first, the Alexandrians tried to keep things tidy. They placed Berenice's mother, Cleopatra VI Tryphena, on the throne. She was older, more acceptable to the public, and more importantly, she wasn't the flute-playing man-child her husband was. But Berenice wasn't about to let her mum take the spotlight. No one knows exactly what happened next, but shortly after Tryphena was crowned, she suddenly died. Some say natural causes, others say poison. But let's just say, if you're in a palace full of cutthroat siblings and your daughter wants your crown, you don't drink anything that isn't sealed. With her mother out of the way, Berenice finally did what few Ptolemaic princesses had done. She took the throne, no brother, no husband, just her. A lone woman declaring herself pharaoh in a world where that usually came with a death sentence. Bold move. But being a female monarch came with a few problems, namely politics, patriarchy, and public opinion. So the Alexandrian elite pressured Berenice to marry, fast. She reluctantly agreed. The first suitor, a prince from Asia Minor, nice guy, too nice. He showed up, looked around and said, "Wow, this place is a mess, I'd like to go home now." So she executed him. Next. The second candidate was a Seleucid prince from Syria. He arrived late. Very late. Berenice, ever patient and understanding, waited all of 1 week. Then she had her guards strangle him in his sleep. Romance is dead. But don't worry, third time's the charm. Her third and final husband was Archelaus, a self-proclaimed son of King Mithridates of Pontus. Spoiler, he was lying. He was actually a Roman general turned traitor with a fake royal backstory. Basically, if Tinder existed in ancient Egypt, this guy's bio would have read, "Totally legit prince. Definitely not a war criminal." Berenice married him anyway, because by now she was running out of options, and bodies. Together they carolled for about a year, But the peace wouldn't last, because guess who decided to come back? Yep, dear old dad. Ptolemy the 12th Orleats, the flute player himself, and he wasn't coming back alone. Act 3. Revenge, Rome, and Ruin. While Berenice was busy choking grooms, Ptolemy the 12th had been busy buying favours in Rome. And by favours, I mean he was straight up bribing the Roman Senate with Egyptian gold. He paid Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great a fortune, just to fund his comeback tour. In 55 BCE, Rome sent an army into Egypt. Ptolemy the 12th returned at the head of it, riding high on debt, betrayal, and vengeance. Berenice prepared for war. She had an army, she had a husband general, but she didn't have Rome, and in this period, if you didn't have Rome on your side, you had nothing. The Roman-led invasion swept through Alexandria. Berenice and her forces tried to hold the palace. It didn't work. Her husband, Archelaus, was killed in the fighting. And Berenice? She was dragged from the palace in chains. No royal trial, no exile, just a quick sentence, handed down by her father. Ptolemy the 12th had his own daughter executed. Let that sink in. The king who fled his kingdom in disgrace, who left his daughters behind to clean up his mess, returns and punishes them for surviving. It was brutal, it was personal, and it was very on brand for the Ptolemaic family. With Berenice dead, the king reinstated his new heir. A young girl with sharp eyes, a sharper mind, and a front row seat to every betrayal. Her name was Cleopatra VII. You've probably heard of her. She was just 14 when her sister was executed, and if there was ever a masterclass on how to survive a bloodthirsty dynasty, Cleopatra had just lived it. Her older sister had tried to rule alone. It got her strangled. So Cleopatra adapted. She played the game differently. Instead of fighting Rome, she seduced it. Instead of ruling alone, she ruled through alliances, and eventually, when her turn came to take the throne, she did it alongside her younger brother, whom she later may or may not have poisoned. But that's another story we'll dive into later on. Consider subscribing if you're interested. Berenice IV is barely remembered today. There are no statues, no temples, just a few dusty mentions in Roman records and Greek papyri. But her ghost haunts Cleopatra's story, because Berenice wasn't just a sister. She was the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you reach too far too fast and without permission. She was also the blueprint, the first Ptolemaic woman to claim the title of Pharaoh without hiding behind a husband or brother. And yes, she killed her way to the top. But in that family, it was either kill or be forgotten. In the end, Cleopatra didn't rise in spite of Berenice's reign. She rose because of it. She learned from her sister's ambition and her execution. And she played a longer, colder game. But no matter how clever, seductive, or brilliant Cleopatra was, the dynasty was already crumbling. Rome had its claws in Egypt. The throne was a trap. And blood, royal or not, was always on the floor. So, when you hear stories of queens and pharaohs, remember this one. A teenage girl who refused to be a pawn, a princess who stared down her own bloodline and chose the crown, and paid for it in blood. What would you choose? Loyalty to your family or the chance to rule? Subscribe for more dark, messy history. Because this wasn't even the worst murder in Cleopatra's family, not by a long shot.